Hello and welcome to the Consulting Specifying Engineer webcast, How to Design for Office Sound Masking, sponsored by Biamp Systems. I'm your moderator, Amara Razgis, and I'm happy to join you today with CSE Consulting Specifying Engineer and CFE Media and Technology. Here are some tips to get the most out of today's webcast event. If you're having any issues with the slides or audio, refresh your browser or click on the Refresh Media button directly under the presenter's picture. You can control the volume settings on your own device or by adjusting the volume on the webcast platform. If you're having technical problems with the audio or with the presentation, click on the question mark at the top right corner of your screen to do a system check before contacting an online technician. If you do need a technician, type a message in the Ask a Question box and someone will get to you as quickly as possible. Individual technical questions will be answered in the Answered Questions box. You can type questions for our speaker in the Ask a Question box on the left side of your screen. We will have a live Q&A at the end of the hour after the prepared presentation is all done. Today's webcast is being recorded and you'll receive an email within about a week with a link to the on-demand version of this event if you'd like to come back. To download a certificate of completion and a PDF copy of this presentation, use the Event Resources tab on the left side of your screen. These documents will also be available with the on-demand version of this webcast. I'm happy to introduce today's presenter, Nathan Van Ness. He's a global product marketing manager responsible for Biamp's building infrastructure portfolio, which includes sound masking and voice communication solutions. He has more than 20 years of experience as a high-tech marketer. Nathan is based in Portland, Oregon. Joining us for the Q&A session after Nathan's presentation is Jeremy Krug. Jeremy is a Biamp field sales engineer responsible for technical sales support in the Western U.S. region. All right, Nathan, I'm going to turn this over to you. Let's begin.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join me today. And thank you, Amara, for that nice lead up to what we're going to be going through today. And without further ado, let's go over the course's 3 separate learning objectives. We're going to define speech privacy and its importance, as well as describe the principles involved in a good acoustical design. Then we're going to identify some of the major design issues related to speech privacy in open offices and private offices. And then we're going to bring it all together to talk about sound masking, understanding what it is and what role it plays in speech privacy. So without further ado, let's talk about speech privacy and the ABCs of acoustics. First, it begs the question, what is speech privacy? Well, here's a pretty simple definition. We define speech privacy as the inability of an unintentional listener to understand another person's conversation. And looking at office workers' acoustics-related complaints, we find that most dissatisfaction centers on being distracted when others' conversations are overheard. Rarely is the problem that there is simply too much noise in the environment. And one of the key points I hope you take away from this presentation is the second bullet listed here. In the world of acoustics, we differentiate between audibility and intelligibility. It's one thing to say that I can hear a conversation that is happening 20 feet away, but it is something else entirely to say that I can understand that conversation in terms of intelligibility. And intelligibility depends on the loudness of overheard speech. As an example, many people have no problem working in a coffee shop or other public place with lots of ambient sound. But once they are in an office, the expectation of privacy is very different. And indeed, the reality of privacy is very different as well. In the office, we're able to understand every word our neighbors are speaking into their phone. But in the coffee shop, it just doesn't seem to matter. So when we define speech privacy, there must be an element of intelligibility. It's not practical to eliminate all conversational sounds in a workplace, but it's certainly possible to significantly reduce intelligible or distracting speech. So why does speech privacy matter? Well, for starters, I'm sure everyone can relate to those times when we're at work, intensely focused on the task at hand, only to be disrupted by a nearby coworker's voice. Maybe they're on the phone arguing with their spouse or yelling at their kid. Maybe we overhear a conversation that discloses private information, like a manager discussing workplace issues and dropping the word layoffs. It's hard to refocus on your work and stay productive when these distractions occur. So speech privacy is a big deal, and a lack of it is incredibly disruptive. In fact, the Center for the Built Environment in San Francisco surveyed more than 25,000 workers in more than 2,000 buildings to determine their key environmental issues. The results mirrored those determined over the last 20 years in similar surveys, specifically that a lack of speech privacy was considered to be the most objectionable among several potential workplace issues. And you'll see those issues listed here to the right, with acoustic privacy being the top concern of all the others, even above office temperature, which I found very interesting when this survey was released. So let's talk about the case for acoustic privacy in terms of industry concerns. The first is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, better known as HIPAA. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. It's essentially the regulation that focuses on the use and disclosure of individuals' health information in any form. It ensures that individuals' health information is protected while allowing the communication flow needed to provide and promote high-quality healthcare. And then we have the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which was introduced in 1999. GLBA requires that financial institutions implement, quote, reasonable safeguards to protect customers' private information. While most institutions focus on electronic and paper communication, oral communication must also be considered. Next is the Hospital Consumer Assessment of Healthcare Providers and Systems, or HCAHPS. This is a national standard, publicly reported patient exit survey regarding hospital care. It enhances public accountability by increasing the transparency of the quality of hospital care provided, and even penalizes hospitals monetarily if privacy and distractions for patients are downgraded based on surveys. And then we have the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, better known as LEED. And this is a standard that addresses specific criteria for corporate projects to meet. 4 criteria have been identified: room noise levels, speech privacy and sound isolation, reverberation time, and paging/sound masking/sound reinforcement systems. And last but not least, we have the WELL standard. This is a building standard and rating system that focuses exclusively on the impact of buildings on human health and wellness. A properly installed sound masking system provides 2 points toward WELL certification. But how is a sufficient level of speech privacy quantified? Remember, we want the speech to be unintelligible when it reaches the listener's ears. To that end, we use a measurement called signal-to-noise ratio to determine how much ambient noise should be added to an environment to make speech unintelligible. Simply put, signal-to-noise ratio is the difference between a person's voice and the background sound level at the listener's ear. As the graph shows, the yellow line represents the sound of a person speaking at 65 decibels. At the listener's ears, which are 24 feet away, the sound has decayed to 47 decibels. 47 decibels is compared to the blue line at 30 decibels. And using simple math, 47 minus 30 equals 17, which is the signal-to-noise ratio, 17 decibels. A signal-to-noise ratio of 15 decibels or greater represents near perfect speech intelligibility. Conversely, as the ratio decreases below 15 decibel, intelligibility decreases as well, which is good for speech privacy. So what should be apparent is that raising the background sound level simultaneously reduces speech intelligibility and improves speech privacy. This is the fundamental premise behind all sound masking systems and devices. Now let's talk about architectural acoustics and the 3 main concepts used to discuss noise control and speech privacy. We refer to them as the ABCs of architectural acoustics. The first is A for absorbing. and most of us are probably familiar with this concept. Absorption is simply the process of adding acoustically absorptive materials to a space, like acoustic ceiling tiles, acoustic wall panels, carpeting, etc. And then we have B for blocking. This is the use of solid barriers to block direct sound from one person or space to another. Typical examples are cubicle partitions, walls, windows, doors, or any other material that has an associated mass that can act as a barrier to sound. And then we have covering. Common forms of covering are unintentional functions of HVAC noise, vehicular traffic, water noise, or anything that is contributing to the background noise level. One of the tools that we use to control background sound is sound masking. And we could also add a D here for distance, which simply acknowledges that sound diminishes as it travels from its source to surrounding listeners, like we just covered in the previous slide. So now looking at modern furniture and construction trends, it isn't much of a stretch to see how the ABCs of architectural acoustics are affected. In open office environments, there's no doubt that cubicle partition heights have come down significantly. Gone are the days of using 60-inch, 65-inch, or even sometimes 70-inch plus partitions. These days, 48-inch and 54-inch partitions are the norm. Plus, LEED and other green building initiatives have had a drastic effect on these heights because of the emphasis on allowing natural light penetration into the interior of the building. When the open office environment trend began years ago, it wasn't uncommon to see 10-foot by 10-foot cubicles. But today, the typical size of cubicles is much more often 8 by 6 feet or 6 by 6 feet. And benching, which is a picnic table method of seating people adjacent to and across from one another with a shared work surface, was also a popular office configuration that was gaining significant traction because it allowed many people to fit into a small space. One result of these new office environment trends is that carpeting, acoustical ceiling tiles, and absorptive cubicle walls became much less common. In more traditional enclosed offices, demountable partitions, which basically are just movable walls, are pretty common because of the ability to quickly and cost-effectively reconfigure an office floor plan. The only problem is that demountable partitions don't extend above the ceiling deck, and for other reasons just aren't very effective noise blockers. But even when traditional walls are used, they most often don't extend to the deck above the subceiling, which then puts the onus on the building material to absorb sound so that it doesn't travel from one space to the next. And glass has become a favorite for many architects and interior designers because it fits well with the desire for openness, staff collaboration, and natural lighting. But unfortunately, glass doesn't perform as well as traditional walls when it comes to blocking sound. In both of these graphics, you'll see the blue C for covering, which shows how sound masking loudspeakers might be used as a noise coverage solution. Now let's talk about design issues. When sound masking technology was first developed, office space looked quite a bit different than what we see today. It was common to see large areas of workstations with consistent grid tile ceilings, maybe with desks grouped like typing pools, or maybe with workstation dividers. Although even as they got more colorful, the acoustical ceilings stayed pretty consistent for decades. The following prioritized list gives the designer the primary variables that affect speech privacy levels in an open office design. Background sound level is listed first here because it has the greatest effect on speech privacy. A sound masking system can effectively add 10 to 15 decibels of noise reduction to a space, while achieving the same reduction with cubicle walls or ceiling treatment is nearly impossible and also very impractical. So on this list, in addition to background sound level, we have barrier effectiveness, ceiling absorption, distance, and head orientation. Pretty basic stuff. This slide illustrates how the arrangement of office cubicles affects speech privacy. This isn't rocket science, but it's worth pointing out. The colored lines represent the direction the voices travel. You'll see in the example to the left, workers face each other across the spline of the workstation walls. Much of the vocal volume would be directed at the neighbors. This is a poor solution. The center layout is better because two of the workers are now facing away. The layout on the right is best because each worker now faces away from the others. Again, pretty basic and logical reasoning here. But regardless of how office occupant seating is configured, it makes sense to identify a distance from a talker inside which the talker is hard to ignore. And beyond that distance, he or she is easy to ignore. We call it the radius of distraction. If we want an office with the most speech privacy possible, where if a person talks, he or she impacts the fewest number of people possible, that means we want the radius of distraction for that area to be as small as possible, as shown in the right side image. Here are a few best practices when designing an open office. Face workers 90 degrees apart in opposite corners. Offset door openings. Add sound masking. Use workstation panels that are 60 inches or taller. And use high-quality ceiling tiles. Now, here are some things to avoid. Don't face workers opposite one another across the workstation spline, as we saw previously. Don't have door openings opposite one another. Don't use tall workstation panels shorter than 54 inches. And don't use low-quality ceiling tiles. And let's discuss how this whole pandemic thing has affected workplace acoustics. I'll start by talking about how things were before the pandemic. In many pre-COVID office environments, we know there were lots of employees packed into their workplace with no social distancing. And honestly, before the pandemic, why would there be? With no social distancing requirements, employees were free to move about, mingle, and conduct work wherever they felt most productive, which meant a high energy level. So there was plenty of constant ambient sound with human activity and a building's normal inorganic noises like the HVAC system or outside traffic or water through pipes, etc. So these are some of the things we expect to see as workers begin to settle into their new normal workplace. In open office environments, we'll likely see staggered work schedules, which will definitely help with distancing. But on-site staff level irregularity will likely cause noise distractions, speech privacy, and employee comfort to be more noticeable issues than they were with consistently and more heavily occupied office spaces. In the more traditional office spaces, we'll see partitions between coworkers made out of acoustically reflective surfaces like plexiglass and antimicrobial material. And because of their reflective nature, these surfaces will be pretty disruptive to your environment's overall acoustics. And as a result, noise distractions, speech privacy, and employee comfort will likely become even bigger challenges. So to reiterate, with less human activity, new desk configurations, and the widespread use of modular barriers and partitions, office acoustics will probably become inconsistent, non-uniform, and less comfortable. We'll see reduced office occupancy, staggered workplace schedules, mandatory distancing, and lots of reflective surfaces. Facility and design teams should address the acoustics of their reconfigured environments. Consideration should also be made to compensate for reduced baseline sound level to help create a space that is comfortable and private, which leads us to sound masking. First, it's worth defining what sound masking is. Sound masking adds a consistent level of ambient background sound to indoor environments. It's often incorrectly compared to white noise. Sound mask is actually specifically engineered to match the frequencies of human speech and to be comfortable or even pleasant to the human ear. When it's implemented properly, sound masking should fade into the background hum of a workplace, while simultaneously making surrounding voices more difficult to hear and understand. As a result, less distracting. Which begs the question, what real-world problems does sound masking solve? I've kind of teased this a little bit, but let's get into it in a little more depth. Sound masking helps achieve 3 outcomes. It protects speech privacy, reduces noise distractions, and increases workplace comfort. The next 4 slides will detail the 4 primary elements of all sound masking systems. In a nutshell, to create an effective sound masking system, we need the correct sound or spectrum, the correct sound level, control over the system with proper zoning, and finally, uniformity of coverage. And when talking about sound spectrum, what we really mean is the right sound. You've probably heard of sound masking being called white noise or pink noise, which are shown here on the graph. And it's fine to call sound masking either white or pink noise for conversations with most end users up to a point. But really, sound masking is, as you see here, a very different sound spectrum than white and pink noise. Sound masking noise differs from both white and pink noise. It's noise that can be thought of as another filter in front of a light. This filter was engineered for the very specific purpose of speech privacy. It considers how we as humans interpret sound with our ears and the frequency content of our voices. So what I'd like you to take away from this slide is that sound masking noise is a very specific type of noise that acoustical engineers created for the purpose of speech privacy. It's related to white noise and pink noise, but there is a clear distinction between the mathematical definition of those and sound masking. And when talking about sound level, what we really mean is the right level. And for comparison purposes, here are the levels of various common sounds in decibels. A quiet library is typically around 30 decibels. Office conversations, right around 60. A vacuum cleaner gets up to about 70 decibels. And the sound of a passenger aircraft from inside the cabin is about 85 decibels. A power drill, right around 98. And then sound masking is ideally set at 48 decibels, which is slightly louder than the average HVAC system. And the next element of sound masking is proper zoning. Sound masking systems must be flexible enough to accommodate complex architectural spaces. With changes in the size, volume, ceiling height, furnishings, etc., masking systems must also change in order to provide a consistent sound field. We do this by incorporating zones into the design so that the system is divided into smaller pieces, each of which can be tuned for that environment. So the easiest example of this is shown on the screen as open office space, private offices, and a reception area zone. Each of these environments are very different from one another acoustically speaking. Therefore, we need to be able to adjust the masking for each one without affecting the others. And a large part of the philosophy of sound masking is the idea that it should be as uniform as possible. The more uniform a noise is, the easier it is for us to tune it out. In every respect, sound masking should be unwavering, constant, and unchanging. Any hot spots, dead spots, or other changes to the noise only serves to increase the likelihood of the occupants noticing it. So for this reason, we often install sound masking in spaces where we are not necessarily concerned with speech privacy, like hallways or corridors, reception areas, lobbies, transitional areas, etc. As you can see here, sound masking speakers are laid out on a grid pattern in such a way that they can effectively cover 100% of the area. Sound masking is emitted from these speakers, creating uniform coverage. You should be able to walk through an office with sound masking and not notice any fluctuations in sound level. It should be consistent so as not to cause disruptions. So someone entering the building should be able to go through the reception area, the open office space, and into a private office and not notice any changes in overall ambient background sound. Now I'll talk about several popular methods of implementing sound masking. The first is through what's called indirect technology. With indirect sound masking, upward firing loudspeakers are placed below the ceiling deck in what's known as the plenum space. The sound masking signal is broadcast against the ceiling deck and then reflects downward, often through ceiling tiles and into the office environment. The major advantage of indirect sound masking is the ability to individually tune the loudspeakers according to the plenum space's variables. Think of things like HVAC ductwork or extensive cabling infrastructure or other acoustics altering factors like piping, etc. In the early 2000s, acoustic consultants came up with an alternate approach to sound masking, taking advantage of advances in loudspeaker and amplifier technology. It's called direct or direct field sound masking. Simple network cabling is used to distribute sound masking to tiny loudspeakers installed throughout the ceiling. And you can see those here as these very small loudspeakers, or what we also call emitters. These emitters broadcast the sound masking signal directly into the environment. Direct field sound masking eliminates some of the commissioning challenges of in-plenum designs and is highly energy efficient. In addition, sound masking can be more completely confined to the areas where it's required, and independent spaces or zones can more precisely receive the desired sound masking levels. A brand new sound masking solution introduced by Biamp earlier this year is a hybrid approach. It enables the installation of both indirect and direct sound masking technologies on a single unified network. So you could consider that we might have indirect sound masking installed on an upper floor, and then on a different floor of the building, we might decide it's better to install a direct field sound masking system because of office acoustics variables. And this slide gives you an idea of some of the places where we implement sound masking. It's common in healthcare facilities like medical office buildings, patient rooms, other places where the primary concern is sleep disturbance, and the secondary concern is speech privacy of outside conversations. Think of things we learned earlier, like HIPAA and HCAPs. Sound masking is often found in government facilities, in legal facilities like lawyers' offices. It's common in education, like labs, libraries, exam rooms, etc. In retail environments, public venues and event spaces, hospitality environments like hotel rooms, and financial institutions like retail banks and call centers. So in summary, it's not just employees who can benefit from increased acoustic privacy. Employers are also incentivized to provide a comfortable working environment for their employees. Worker productivity increases when acoustic distractions are reduced. Absorption, blocking, and covering, or as we learned, the ABCs of architectural acoustics, all define the potential speech privacy of an environment. Key elements of successful sound masking include uniformity, proper zoning, sound spectrum, and sound level. Office designers have a variety of tools at their disposal to effectively create spaces with appropriate levels of acoustic privacy. In open office acoustics, the design goal should be to achieve a privacy index of at least 80%. To achieve this goal, background noise, barrier effectiveness, distance between workers, ceiling absorption, and head orientation must all be considered. By only adding masking, the privacy index can be increased substantially, and the associated cost is lower than either ceiling tiles or high partitions. Sound masking is appropriate not just for open office environments, but also for applications in healthcare, education, finance, government, and more, as we saw on the previous slide. Now let's learn a little bit more about my company, Biamp Systems. We're a leading provider of innovative networked media systems. We have all sorts of technologies in our portfolio, from digital signal processing and loudspeakers to convenience paging and enterprise-class voice communication systems. Like I alluded to previously, this year we introduced the groundbreaking QTX series sound masking solution. It's a hybrid approach that creates direct and indirect sound masking on a single unified network. And I am done with my presentation. Now it's time for the Q&A session, Mara.
All right, that is some excellent information. Thank you so much, Nathan. And now Nathan and Jeremy will answer questions directly from the audience. Please type your question to them in the Ask a Question box on your screen, and we will get to as many questions as time allows. Questions that we do not get to today will be posted online at www.csemag.com with the archived version of this webcast. And please remember to download a certificate of completion or a copy of this presentation. You can use the Event Resources tab on the left side of your screen. All right, gentlemen, let's take a few questions here. We have quite a few. Again, if you have specific questions, you can type them into the question box on the left side of your screen. All right, here. First question, is there an average cost per square foot for an installed sound masking system?
I'll probably be taking most of these, so yes, the primary issue that we have with giving an exact number for sound masking systems installed is the labor rate for different areas. Generally speaking, the hardware cost is fairly consistent. However, hardware costs for a lot of products across all industries are going up. So while we historically had been saying $2 to $2.50 a square foot installed would be kind of an average price, I imagine at this point it would probably be more likely to say going forward $2.50 to $3 a square foot installed. And the biggest factor that's going to impact that is going to be the labor rates. So if you've got something like a union building in San Francisco, maybe that's going to be $4.50 or $5 a square foot. If you've got a non-union building in Tulsa, Oklahoma, maybe that's going to be closer to that $2 or $2.50 a square foot range. That's really going to be the driving factor for the cost.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Jeremy. Let's move on to the next question here. With people working off-site and social distancing, how does this affect sound masking? Great question.
Mm-hmm. Obviously a big concern. The distancing is going to be interesting because technically having people further apart means that their voice has more opportunity to decay and lower in volume before it reaches a potential listener. But to Nathan's point in the presentation, it also means that the overall office space is going to be quieter. So when you have a quiet environment, it's easier to hear voices at a distance because the background noise level is lower. So what we might find is actually that sound masking becomes more important because the spaces are more empty. I like to use the comparison of a library that's not very busy, and if someone bats their eyelashes too loud, you can hear it, versus something like a shopping mall that's very busy and somebody could drop a cinder block 20 feet away and you probably wouldn't notice. So that kind of idea.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. This is going back to a specific slide here. Key elements sound spectrum. Does the sound masking system simultaneously pull out multiple frequencies and amplitudes within the recommended spectrum? And then part 2 of this question, or does it continuously readjust based on some type of signal feedback it receives from the space?
So that is a fair question, and I love the technical ones. They're fun. So it is random noise at its heart, and in most of our systems, we use multiple independently random generators. They are set to within the same frequency range, so we don't cover the entire range of human hearing from earthquakes to dog whistles, just the human range of speech. And we will have a random noise generator in that range that is then adjusted for where vowels and consonants are. But it is random noise in that sense. We don't use devices that listen to the environment and try to adapt to it, primarily because the physics that's involved in something like that is extremely difficult. In an open office space, the environment is chaotic, meaning just not as controlled an environment as you might have in a lab or something enclosed like an automobile. So we don't know what direction sound is coming from or where it's going to. So the safest approach, the most effective approach is the random noise generator and tuning it correctly in that regard. Also, listening in on office spaces is generally a bad idea. So having the microphones around, we try to avoid.
Very good. Thank you. Next question for you. Is commissioning a set it and forget it process, or does the sound masking system include permanently installed microphones for continuous real-time feedback? This goes back to the previous question just a little bit.
It does kind of relate to that. So in most cases, it tends to be something of a set it and forget it mostly. We do encourage end users who rearrange their offices to have the sound masking system revisited periodically and retuned. But in general, what we're looking for from the sound masking system is that it be tuned and adjusted to deliver the sound masking spectrum at the volume level that's expected based on the room acoustics that are present. And the primary drivers of the differences in room acoustics are going to be the ceiling height, the wall material, whether the floor is carpeted or polished concrete or something like that. Furnishings obviously have an impact, and bodies in the space have an impact. But overall, sound masking is tuned based on the acoustical environment. So anything that changes that acoustical environment would prompt retuning the system. But it doesn't need to be something that's manipulated on its own on a day-to-day basis. There again, microphones in the office space generally frowned upon, but also you would need a lot of microphones to cover the area because they're going to need to have a consistent view of where the sound has changed and adjust the system accordingly. So it becomes very cumbersome. When we measure a system, we actually measure at multiple locations around a floor to get things even and consistent as possible.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeremy. Let me ask you this next one here. We've got a lot of really great questions. Have studies been done to see how sound masking affects long-term hearing loss?
It's one of the most so I won't say it's the most common. I get a very common question of just general health concerns. Is it going to affect my hearing? Is it going to give me headaches, make my hair fall out, and those sorts of things? You'd be surprised at some of the weird ones I've gotten over the years. Unfortunately, there's not really a way to do a longitudinal study of, so you've been in the presence of low-level background noise for some number of years, have you lost hearing versus that hearing loss potentially occurring from all the other environmental factors, such as the much louder traffic noise and things like that. What I can say is that sound masking is random noise that is focused on the human range of speech and set at a volume level that is equivalent to what you would measure the volume of my voice 25 feet away from me. So in that sense, it is quite literally in terms of the physical spectrum of the sound and measurements, it is the equivalent of a whisper. And the sound of whispering voices has not been shown ever to impact people's hearing. In fact, OSHA has limits on the environmental noise for workspaces. They do not even begin counting until 85 decibels of sound pressure level, and sound masking is generally in the realm of about 45 to 48 decibels of sound pressure level, and that is a logarithmic scale, so it's not double the energy. Every 10 points is 10 times the energy. So quite literally, where sound masking is 1/10,000th, I think, or 100,000th lower total energy in a space than where OSHA even says, oh, at 85 decibels, you have to wear hearing protection if you're exposed for more than 8 hours a day. So it's the same kind of white noise we use to help babies get to sleep at night, if you think of it that way.
Sure. Okay. So kind of talking about general noise, how does background music provide any sound masking, if at all?
I saw that question in there as well. So background music does have some effect, and that's why for years people have used it in lobbies and waiting rooms and things like that, so that it covers up the sound of people talking. The main thing about background music that is different from sound masking systems is one, it's dynamic, it's changing, and so it draws attention to itself. You hear the music, and will tend to listen along, or have employees who complain, I don't like that station, whatever it happens to be. It's also not as focused on human speech as sound masking is. And when the music inevitably, when the song ends before the next song comes up, there is some space of silence. So actually, I have a lot of clients who use our sound masking systems for background music in places like doctor's office lobbies. And what I always recommend is that we set the masking level a little lower than we might normally, set the music just above that, so that basically people interpret it as, I'm hearing the sound of the background music, but as the song happens to taper off and the next one comes up, there's always that baseline level of sound masking that's protecting the privacy of speech, especially important in healthcare. So we kind of use them both as a blend.
Right. Okay. Next question for you. What are the office variables that determine if direct or indirect sound masking is the masking option of choice?
I saw this one come up, and I'm glad we were able to get to it, because it's one of the good ones. The primary driver for our decision, when we look at a space and say we should use this technology or this technology, since we have both available and additional ones beyond that, we have underfloor sound masking, where if we've got a raised access floor environment, we can actually have sound masking come up from below instead of down from above. The important thing for sound masking is we want to get the sound masking sound to wherever the ears are that shouldn't hear. That's actually kind of a great encapsulation of how to design sound masking systems in general. But so the listener's ears are everybody in the open office. And I want to get there as cleanly and as efficiently as possible. So basically what's going to drive whether we use an indirect system or direct system, we're trying to get sound to the listener's ears. Usually it's from the ceiling. So the biggest driver is going to be, what's the ceiling made of? Open to structure ceilings are very different than grid tile ceilings. We very often these days see grid tile reduced a little bit to just cloud areas. Well, cloud areas are tricky. If we use an indirect system that's reflecting off the deck and coming back down through the ceiling tiles, well, at the edge of the cloud, you're going to have some sound that goes through the grid tile ceiling and some that spills over the edge and does not have the tile, and they're going to sound different because that tile impacts the sound. So there's an example of where we would use direct devices because the ceiling is changing. So if I can have something that is placed and deployed in a way where there's nothing in between the sound masking device and the listener's ear other than air, I get a lot more consistency. As soon as I have something that's blocking in there, the indirect system, I have to be very concerned about the ceiling material. So, so really, it's the architecture, primarily the ceiling, and that's going to be our main driving factors.
Okay, good. Thank you. This next question is referring to a lead facility. How often do you have to recalibrate the system to ensure it's working correctly?
As far as I know, there is not a lead certification about the calibration of the system. Like, I don't think lead says it must be done every 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, whatever. So really, I would default back to the recommendation that because it's an acoustical treatment that is adjusted based on the office acoustics, the time that it should be recalibrated is going to be any time there is a significant change that impacts the office acoustics. And that's going to be change of wall, ceiling, and floor materials, or major changes in the furniture layout or material types.
Okay, thank you. Next question. This person's office is next to a noisy highway. What are the options to cancel noises? Any suggestions?
That one's really tough. One of the things that sound masking does not do is it does not cancel sound. And that's one of the probably the most, at this point, the most common question that we tend to get is it canceling sound? In order to cancel sound the way something like a headphone does, you need to know where the sound is coming from, everywhere outside of the headphone, where it's going to, that ear. You need to get in between it and be able to measure, invert it to cancel it, and play it into the ear so that you have the original sound, the inverted sound, and they physically cancel. That is not possible in a chaotic environment like even a small office where the sound is kind of coming from everywhere at their exterior wall, not just the window, of course, and the destination is their ears, but their ears move around in the room. So realistically, the only way to hold back traffic noise is to try to block it more. That would be improving the windows. But a lot of times that's not an option for somebody in an office space, or something that is very focused on their ears. It's unfortunately, traffic noise is a tough one. And believe me, we have lots of hotel clients who have hotels that are located right off the interstate, who would love it if we had some kind of technology for that. And we could probably all retire. But unfortunately, physics works against us in that one.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to the next question here. Mm-hmm. Does the spectrum envelope of a typical commercial HVAC system provide a good fit for sound masking?
That one's a great one. No. So HVAC is not tuned to the voice. It tends to be a very low rumble. Masking sound sounds a lot like HVAC, but quite often what you have with HVAC systems is that it's primarily low frequency. There is some extension into higher frequencies where the human voice also resides. However, if you look at the spectrum of where the human voice is on low frequencies to high frequencies versus where HVAC systems are, they're missing the portion of the spectrum where the critical intelligibility comes from, and that's actually the kind of higher frequencies, the KTD sounds that are made. So for that reason, HVAC doesn't really do the job. The other reason that HVAC is not really suited for sound masking is it's inconsistent for coverage. It's noisier in some places and quieter in other areas. And also it turns on and off, unless you have a building that's running static load on it. But everybody's probably had that experience once where the air conditioning turned off at 5 o'clock, and there was a phrase that they used to use in the 90s called prairie dogging. The air conditioning went off and all the heads popped up from the cubicles going, what just happened? That's a good example of the inconsistency of HVAC and why it doesn't really work there.
Right. Okay. Let's see here. More questions. Moving on. What would you suggest for office spaces without hung ceilings and an 11-foot slab to slab height? What would you suggest for sound masking there?
Call us. We have a design team. But no, so that's actually a great example. So the ceiling height is going to dictate how far apart the devices can go, because we're trying to get evenness of coverage. And the primary driver in something like an open deck ceiling like that, especially at 11 feet, that's tricky. It's low enough that if I hang something indirect, I have to be at least about 3 feet below. That's going to put me at about 8 feet above finished floor. I'm going to bet that an architect or an interior designer is not going to want a whole bunch of devices across an open area that are aimed upwards at the ceiling and have to be at 8 feet above finished floor when they're trying to have open to structure to make the space feel more open. So more than likely what we're going to do is a direct approach, because we've got a relatively low ceiling. If there's not a lot of HVAC system, we could actually bring those devices right up to the deck so that they're sitting just a few inches below and playing down and covering the space very evenly. If we've got a lot of HVAC that's there, we may have to drop them somewhat, but we won't have to drop as far as we would for an indirect device that's trying to reflect. So more than likely, direct field's going to be the answer, possibly at the deck, maybe dropped to 10 feet above finished floor, something that would be even with the HVAC system. How's that?
Awesome. Thank you.
Welcome.
All right. Next question. This is a great question. Are there any codes and standards for sound masking design?
To my knowledge, there are not. There's no code out there for sound masking systems. There is some FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt out there in the world regarding fire alarm code and sound masking. The notion that fire alarms need to reach in and mute sound masking systems if they are activated. That is actually not required in most jurisdictions. However, primarily because sound masking systems play so quietly and fire alarm systems play so loudly. We are playing at the volume level of whisper, not at the volume level of normal conversational speech. However, all of our systems are designed with a kill switch so that a fire alarm system can reach in and stop the masking instantly if there's an alarm activated. So that is about as close as we get to code. As a company who makes and sells sound masking equipment, I would love it if it were required by code. In the United States, it is not. In Canada, it is actually part of the, what is it called? Workplace 2.0 Canadian federal government requirements. So in Canada, Workplace 2.0 does require sound masking to be present in buildings.
Sure. Okay. So in your presentation, Nathan, you mentioned that sound masking is typically designed for 80%. And if this person heard correctly, he's wondering what this 80% is, and if you could elaborate on those details.
Yeah, and I wanted to weigh in on this one. I unintentionally removed a slide earlier in the week, and that slide talked about the privacy index. And I mentioned that in my summary of this presentation. And you're probably wondering what that point was summarizing, because I didn't talk about the privacy index. So, Jeremy, that's what they're referring to with regard to the 80% figure.
Gotcha. I was sitting there somewhat confused about it. So there is a scale that is used, and it is actually a measurement scale that's recognized by construction management organizations and such, ANSI and such, called the Privacy Index scale, and it is a scale from ostensibly from 0% to 100%. It actually only goes from 0% to 95%, and it is actually, curiously enough, kind of graded like school grades. So 90 percentile is A, 80 percentile is B, 70 percentile is C, D, and anything below 60 is failing. Is kind of how that scale goes together. The trick to it is that it's a measurement that takes into account a lot of factors. Reverberation time of the room, absorption of materials, sound transmission content, and STC of the wall materials and door materials. It's a tricky one that is actually only measurable after a building is finished. There is a much simpler measurement that is the speech privacy potential that uses the same scale. And this was developed by the GSA as a predictor of office spaces, which is a lot more what we need when we're designing spaces. And it tries to calculate what the privacy would be for a private office based on the STC of the room, the entire room system, and the background noise outside. And quite simply, if you add the two numbers together, you get a score, and that score on a scale where 60% is failing, 75 is kind of okay, 85 is great, 95 is spectacular. That gives you a score of privacy. So if a typical room build is built to, say, 40 STC, and 40 STC doors are actually kind of hard to come by, so they tend to be a little bit lower, but we'll say 40 STC. If the background noise outside the space is library quiet at, say, 30 to 35 decibels, 40 STC plus 30 to 35 decibels, score of 70 to 75 privacy potential. So the best you can get is about a C minus. But if we take that outside sound level and bring it up to the 45 decibels that sound masking provides, well, now that 40 STC office and the 45 decibels outside become an 85% score. We've got a solid B, and we've got some privacy there. And it is a much cheaper solution on a cost per square foot basis than trying to make all of the walls of your private offices more intense, and especially the doors, because 45 STC doors are crazy stinking expensive compared to, say, a 38.
Okay, awesome. Well, we have time for one more question.
Okay.
How does sound masking impact people with hearing aids or those with unaided hearing impairments?
So it's an interesting thing. That's one that comes up as concerns. People with hearing aids will, of course, hear the sound masking, and they will sometimes complain that, hey, I'm hearing this background noise, and it's making it harder for me to hear people in the office. Yes. That's what's supposed to happen. It should not impact somebody with hearing aids any differently. There's nothing in a hearing aid microphone that should be able to listen to the sound masking sound, pick it out, and say, "Oh, I'm going to turn that up louder," to the detriment of every other sound that's out there. It should be hearing the sound of the environment around them and boosting specifically the frequencies that they are having difficulty hearing. Now, hearing aids do need to be tuned. They're actually a prescription, and they should be checked once a year, because the audiologist will see where somebody's hearing is deficient, and make sure that that's where the volume level is turned up. You don't want to turn up the volume level where somebody actually has good hearing, because then it gives a weird tonal sort of humming sound to everything that they hear. So it should not affect it, although in practice, I generally find that people with hearing aids will say, well, I hear this thing and it's making it hard for me to hear. And I have to tell them, well, yes, it's making it harder for everybody to hear. That's the point. And that's not something they're used to. As far as somebody without hearing aids, but just a general hearing impairment, Usually the best example of that would be tinnitus. So if you have ringing in your ears, sound masking actually covers it. It's the same reason that you don't tend to notice that tinnitus ringing in your ears during the daytime when there's background noise around you, but you lie down to sleep at night and suddenly that ringing is there and very present. So the little bit of background noise actually can help in that case. And that's probably it for our questions, but of course the ones we didn't reach we'll try to answer verbally through an email.
Fantastic. We're going to wrap things up here. Thanks again to our speakers, Nathan Van Ness and Jeremy Krug, both from Biamp Systems, for sharing their time and expertise. And I would like to extend a thank you to our sponsor, Biamp Systems, for sponsoring today's education session. And now that we are just about done, we want your feedback. The exit survey will pop up on your screen as soon as this webcast ends. Please take a moment to complete it because we do use this information to improve future events. Finally, on behalf of Consulting, Specifying Engineer, and CFE Media and Technology, I'd like to thank you for attending. This concludes our webcast. Thank you and goodbye.